the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic, or BSSR, emerged from the tumultuous aftermath of World War I and the Russian Revolution. After a brief period of independence as the Belarusian People's Republic, Belarus came under the control of Soviet Russia. This led to the official formation of the BSSR in 1922. In 1924, territories with Belarusian majorities were added from Soviet Ukraine and Soviet Russia. These additions solidified the geographical boundaries of Soviet Belarus. The early years of the BSSR were marked by efforts to establish a socialist system. This involved collectivization of agriculture and rapid industrialization. These policies, however, were often met with resistance from the Belarusian population. Many peasants, for example, opposed collectivization and the loss of their land. Despite these challenges, the BSSR underwent significant transformation in the years leading up to World War II. World War II brought unprecedented devastation to Belarus. Caught between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, Belarus became a battleground. The Nazi occupation, which lasted from 1941 to 1944, was brutal. The Nazis implemented a policy of systematic terror and exploitation. Villages were razed, cities were destroyed, and countless civilians were murdered. The Belarusian people mounted a fierce resistance against the Nazi occupation. Partisan groups operated throughout the country, sabotaging German supply lines and engaging in guerrilla warfare. The human cost of the war was staggering. Belarus lost an estimated one-third of its population, a devastating demographic blow. The war left an indelible scar on the Belarusian psyche, shaping the country's development for decades to come. In the aftermath of World War II, Belarus emerged as a founding member of the United Nations in 1945. This recognition, despite being a Soviet republic, highlighted the country's significant wartime sacrifices and its desire for a peaceful future. Belarus's membership in the UN provided a platform for international engagement. It also gave the Belarusian SSR a degree of influence in global affairs. Throughout the Cold War, Belarus generally aligned with Soviet policies within the UN. However, its membership in the organization provided a window to the outside world. This fostered cultural and academic exchanges that would later contribute to the growth of Belarusian national consciousness. The experience of being a founding UN member left a lasting legacy on Belarus. It reinforced the country's aspirations for sovereignty and international recognition. The late 1980s witnessed a period of profound transformation across the Soviet Union. Belarus was no exception to these winds of change. Under the leadership of Mikhail Gorbachev, the USSR underwent a period of political and economic reforms known as perestroika and glasnost. These reforms, aimed at revitalizing the Soviet system, inadvertently unleashed long-suppressed nationalist sentiments. In Belarus, the Chernobyl disaster of 1986 proved to be a pivotal moment. The disaster, which exposed the shortcomings of the Soviet system in terms of transparency and accountability, had a profound impact on Belarusian society. It fueled a growing environmental movement and intensified calls for greater autonomy. The Belarusian intelligentsia began to openly discuss the country's history, language, and culture, which had been suppressed during the Soviet period. These factors contributed to a growing sense of national identity and a desire for self-determination. Section 5, Independence Day, August 25, 1991. On August 25, 1991, Belarus declared its independence from the collapsing Soviet Union. This historic event marked the culmination of years of growing national consciousness and a desire for self-determination. After the failed August coup in Moscow, the Belarusian parliament adopted the Act of Declaration of State Sovereignty of the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic. The Declaration of Independence was met with widespread jubilation across Belarus. People took to the streets to celebrate the birth of a new nation, free from Soviet rule. The transition to independence was not without its challenges. The country faced a daunting task of building new political, economic, and social structures from scratch. Nevertheless, August 25, 1991 remains a pivotal moment in Belarusian history, marking the beginning of a new chapter in the country's long journey. Section 6. The rise of Lukashenko from collective farm director to authoritarian president. In 1994, Alexander Lukashenko, a former collective farm director, was elected as the first president of Independent Belarus. Lukashenko's rise to power was unexpected. He campaigned on a platform of nostalgia for the Soviet past, promising stability and economic security. Many Belarusians, disillusioned by the economic hardships of the post-Soviet transition, found his message appealing. Upon assuming office, Lukashenko moved swiftly to consolidate his power. He centralized authority, curtailed press freedoms, and cracked down on political opposition. His rule became increasingly authoritarian, characterized by a lack of transparency, suppression of dissent, and disregard for human rights. Under Lukashenko's leadership, Belarus became increasingly isolated from the West. Despite international criticism, Lukashenko maintained a firm grip on power, relying on a combination of Soviet-style repression and populist rhetoric. His rule transformed Belarus into the last dictatorship in Europe. Section 7. An alliance forged Belarus and Russia in a post-Soviet world. The late 1990s and early 2000s witnessed a strengthening of ties between Belarus and Russia under Lukashenko's rule. This alliance was driven by a complex interplay of economic, political, and security considerations. Belarus, heavily reliant on Russian energy supplies and facing Western sanctions, sought economic and political support from Moscow. Russia, for its part, viewed Belarus as a strategically important buffer zone against NATO expansion. The two countries signed a series of agreements that deepened their cooperation in various fields, including trade, energy, and military. This alliance, however, came at a cost for Belarus. It led to increasing dependence on Russia and further eroded Belarus's sovereignty. Critics argued that Lukashenko had effectively traded away Belarus's independence for economic and political support from Moscow. Section 8. The August Uprising challenging Lukashenko's grip on power. The 2020 Belarusian presidential election proved to be a watershed moment in the country's post-Soviet history. The election, widely seen as rigged in favor of Lukashenko, sparked unprecedented mass protests across the country. Hundreds of thousands of Belarusians took to the streets to demand free and fair elections, the release of political prisoners, and an end to Lukashenko's rule. The protests, known as the August Uprising, were met with a brutal crackdown by the Belarusian authorities. Police used excessive force, tear gas, and rubber bullets against peaceful demonstrators. Thousands were arrested, and numerous reports of torture and ill treatment emerged from Belarusian prisons. The crackdown on the protests drew international condemnation, with the European Union and the United States imposing sanctions on Lukashenko and his regime. Section 9. Belarus today, a nation at a crossroads. As of 2024, Belarus finds itself at a crossroads. The country remains under the firm control of Alexander Lukashenko, who shows no signs of relinquishing power. The political opposition has been decimated, with many leaders either imprisoned or forced into exile. Independent media has been silenced, and civil society organizations face constant harassment. Despite the ongoing repression, the spirit of resistance remains alive in Belarus. The August Uprising demonstrated the desire for change among a significant segment of the population. The international community continues to condemn Lukashenko's regime and support the Belarusian people's aspirations for democracy and human rights. The future of Belarus remains uncertain, but the events of recent years have shown that the yearning for freedom and democracy cannot be extinguished, even in the face of authoritarianism.